So thank you for coming. This is every year we try to bring in a couple of national leaders to speak in areas related to positive youth development and how we want to think about those kinds of things. And the genesis of this invitation is sort of twofold. One is I first met Ed when we were both finishing, and he was finishing up here through Dick. So we've known each other a long time. So it was an opportunity we got to catch up at a meeting in Washington that actually Richard was chairing. And I told him about what I was doing with positive youth development, and he's been doing very important work in what isn't typically thought of as a positive youth development issue, which is how kids in juvenile justice systems fare and how are we handling them and what are the things that make a difference in their dispositions and their outcomes. But as we talked, it was clear that maybe there really was something important, because he's been looking at an issue that actually people are very interested in and we know almost nothing about it, and it turns out not to be nearly as ordered as we'd like, which is how kids stop becoming delinquent. Most do. Most stop becoming delinquent. Most kids go on to live productive lives even though engaged in some kind of delinquency. So invited him down because it would be a really great way to try to make this connection, this intersection. The second part of the invitation is he's one of my favorite people to pose tough questions to, because he's going to try and figure it out, and he's got the capability to do that. So I thought this was a tough question. Can you talk about positive youth development and Desistance? So let me tell you a little bit more about him for those of you who don't know him. Ed is a professor of psychiatry at University of Pittsburgh Medical School. He also is on the advisory board for National Institute of Justice. Office of Justice Programs, which is at the National Institute of Justice. Yeah. And he's also on an IOM committee that's interested in a committee on assessing juvenile justice reform and National Academy of Sciences. So he's involved in a lot of policy work really at the kind of policy setting level. So people listen to him for good reasons. But he's also a first-rate scientist, producing some of the best, strongest, and most thoughtful work on the intersection of mental health and law and juvenile justice, as well as these issues around what really happens to kids that we bring into this, what's supposed to be this reform and support juvenile justice system. So with that, I'll stop. Ed?
Thanks. I'm going to take that. I always love when people introduce you and they say all these nice things, because the line usually is, I wish my parents were here to hear this, because my father would have appreciated it and my mother would have believed it, so it's kind of how you feel when they do this. I'm going to talk a little bit today, as Patrick mentioned, about juvenile justice policy. And I just want to open this with just a quick statement that we're in the flux of change right now in terms of juvenile justice policy. Things aren't the way they were for 15 or 20 years or so. And I think it's fair to say that summed up in a lot of ways in the Miller opinion, Justice Kagan's comment of incorrigibility is inconsistent with youth. And the recent comments and in decisions have said, yes, kids are developing and it's a longer time period of development. This has been portrayed as a number of different factors of eras of juvenile justice, and this is in the NAS report that Richard largely wrote, with just a little assistance from a couple of people.
Thank you.
Yes, exactly. And it lays out 4 eras, and I think it is safe to say we're in kind of a rethinking developmental era in juvenile justice. This has had quite an influence on the way that court decisions are going, the way states are thinking about juvenile justice policy, and I think it's just important to keep that in mind as we move forward here. There's 2 aspects that have affected this. One is this adolescence is a distinct phase. We've sort of said adolescents really are different from kids and they are different from adults. And the implication that there's some malleability and change in late adolescence and early adulthood, and therefore there might be some amenability. There's no sense in giving up. There's no sense in treating them all as one class. These are moving targets, okay? This sort of thinking has gotten real sway in the policy discussions. And that supports treatment and rehabilitation in public opinion polls. showed that people generally support rehabilitation and treatment rather than punishment. And the interventions have talked about being responsible for supporting positive development, so that the juvenile justice system is not simply a public safety tool. It's also a way that we should think about how do we create and work with environments that take kids who are involved in juvenile justice and promote positive development. So I think Patrick's characterization of juvenile justice is an area where the thoughts of positive development really are just beginning, but I think they're beginning rather strongly at this point. So I just wanted to set that stage for where we are. Because that makes the study we've been doing reasonably relevant in that policy context, we're very interested in pathways to desistance, and I'm aware that desistance is not a word. If you put it in, the word will send it back to you and say it's misspelled and everything else. It's social science, we made it up, all right? It just means stop, desist, okay? And I'll give you a little background on the project. It's been going on for a good long time. It grew out of the MacArthur Research Network on Adolescent Development and Juvenile Justice. And this is a group brought together by the MacArthur Foundation, researchers and practitioners a long time ago. And the idea is to develop a research agenda that would get empirical information that would be valuable to juvenile justice policy and practice. And the mandate is usually like, well, look 10 years ahead, and what issues are still going to be around, and what can you generate in that time period that will help to inform those issues to have a better, more informed system in place at that point. The topics that the network said were still going to be around and would be focused on, which resemble, amazingly, the Mental Health and Law Network topics as well that preceded this network. And it's the competence and culpability of adolescents, how they make decisions, are they really different from adults, how does that affect their processing and their perceptions of the system. Risk of offending, how many kids are going to go on, who isn't going to go on. This is always the problem, how do we sort these kids? And the other one is amenability. What can we do that will make a difference? How amenable are they to certain interventions? The Pathways to Desistance study really addresses these last two topics. It addresses risk and amenability. So it was a major initiative of the network to do this study so that we could get enough information about these topics, okay? We've been fortunate to be supported by a number of people over the years. This is a list of people who have provided support for the study, and it's a very generous and long-lasting support on these people's parts, so we really, really appreciate it. And when I say we, this is the list of the working group members who worked on this project. I'm not going to, all the stuff I'm going to present today, obviously I didn't do. You know, I mean, a lot of these people did it, and I will hopefully recognize them along the way, but if I don't, realize this has been a large group effort, and these are not all my results and not all my studies. And I still maintain that the major positive outcome the study has had is to have 10 academics working together for 10 years, and no one's sued or died in the process, so I think that's pretty good. Okay. So what are we focusing on and what are we interested in? As Patrick mentioned, a lot of kids stop offending, okay? This is the age crime curve, if you've seen this around. It's a number of arrests by age. And what you see is that, you know, crime is largely the province of the young. Most arrests occur at this period from the mid-teens to the early 20s. And the interesting thing about this is that crime has dropped, if you don't notice this, but the top curve is 1990, and then it goes down. The curve goes down, meaning the number of arrests have dropped over the last 10 to 15 years, but the shape has stayed the same, okay? So while we have less arrests, we're still arresting the same age kids in this. Now what's interesting is we know a fair amount from longitudinal work about risk factors that bring kids into the system, how they initiate antisocial behavior. We know much less about this drop-off, this curve right here that goes down, and we talk about as desistance, this process of people stopping in their early 20s, from mid-adolescence to early 20s. A lot of kids who get in trouble get out of trouble, okay? And how does that happen? So, if you think about that, what we realize is we just don't know much about serious adolescent offenders, because a lot of these kids are more serious offenders, and you can't desist something if you haven't started it, so we've got to get kids who are already in and offending in the system. And we know that there are some general processes that occur that could be related to desistance, just normal developmental processes. One is maturation. We know from a lot of the studies we've been doing on development that kids' impulsivity changes. We know their sense of responsibility changes. So there's just some individual maturation, and we all have enough anecdotes of friends of ours, and it's always friends of ours who did stupid things when they were younger and now they're okay, you know, so it jives with what we know about how kids change. And there are also normative life changes. You get new friends, you move away from your family, you get a job for a longer time period than you had one before, you might have a romantic relationship. This is a period of very, very normative life change. But because these kids are not chosen at random, they're going to be in the system and they're going to be offending, we're going to do something to them or for them. When do it to do it for them. And so there's some system involvement. There are going to be sanctions or interventions that are going to occur, and we need to know what those effects might be. Obviously, the overall goal is that if we can generate information about desistance, we can hopefully focus programs, sanctions and interventions, or risk assessment strategies that build on empirical information about the kids who end up in the system, all right? So this is a large naturalistic study. And we always depict this study as being deceptively simple. It's really, you get a lot of kids and you follow them. I mean, what's the problem, right? So we start in 2 sites. We start in Philadelphia and in Phoenix. We did that because they're large enough metropolitan areas to have enough serious offending kids. I would have wanted to do it in Pittsburgh. We don't have enough serious offending kids that we could follow them over a given time period and get enough data. So we did it in Philadelphia and in Phoenix, and we had excellent collaborators on the ground, and we had excellent system cooperation. We looked at a number of different sites, and these two, it was doable there. It also gave us an interesting ethnic mix, which I'll go into as we go over this. We enrolled 1,354 felony offenders who were minors at the time of their offense. They were adjudicated of a felony charge. This is not the arresting charge. This is what the court said they did. They were right before disposition. These are 98.4 felony charges. There's a couple of weapons charges, a couple sex offenses that were left in, but these are predominantly felony offending kids. We took as many females as we could because there's just not a lot known about serious female offenders. And we took the transfer cases. So even if a kid came in and was transferred up to the adult court, we kept that adolescent in the sample because we wanted to know where they'd be in 7 years anyway. And we can talk about differential transfer rates and issues there if you'd like to. We also capped the sample at 15% drug offenders. If we didn't do that, we were going to rapidly have a sample of drug offenders, okay? Because Philadelphia in particular has a lot of drug charges coming through the court. And the felony drug charges were of interest to us, but we didn't want just felony drug charges, okay? All right, so then we did initial interviews, what we're calling time point interviews, and release interviews. Initial interviews were, as I say, right about at the time of disposition. This got a lot of background information. Time point interviews, if you want to really follow somebody developmentally, you want to catch them at about the same time. So we did it every 6 months for 3 years, and then we did annually after that. You know, so you got 6, 12, 18, 24, 30, 36, and then you go to 48, 60, 72, 84 months out. Okay, so we got a 7-year follow-up period on these adolescents. And I just list the number of things we covered in the release interview just to indicate there's a number of domains that are of interest, as I mentioned, in those large areas of sort of normative change and internal change and sanctions and interventions and so on. We also did release interviews, and I'll mention these because I'm going to come back to this data set. It's a separate data set, but if we knew that adolescents went into an institution during this time period, we made efforts to interview them either 30 days before they were released or within 30 days after they were released. And we asked them about their institutional stay. We wanted to know aspects of the institution, what services they received, and so on. And this is really I don't want to say a side project, but it gives us a different way to think about institutional interventions, okay? And we got other forms of information. We did collateral interviews at the baseline at 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years. At the baseline, we did collateral interviews usually with parents. This is someone the adolescent recommends that knows what's going on in his or her life. And at 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, we did peers because parents are not the best reporters of substance use and antisocial behavior after they've been enrolled and involved with the court. So we have peer interviews for that time. We didn't do peer interviews after 3 years. We frankly just couldn't justify the cost. And the kids were telling us just about the same things that the peers were telling us, and we weren't, the yield was not great, okay? We also pull official records. We pull FBI national records for arrest. We pull local court records and some service records, but I'm not going to go into the range of service records that we have, okay? All right. I put this big list up here, and I'm not going to go through it. This is just to give you an idea that we had a comprehensive set of factors we considered about psychological change and background characteristics, family makeup, relationships, and community context. I put it up here because I'm encouraging people, and this is great when you come to an academic place. I want to encourage people. We did a lot of work on measurement, and Cindy's shaking her head up and down. she's been in this data set. But we've done a lot of work on measurement, and I would encourage people, if they're thinking about measures, we document the psychometrics of the instruments we've used. We tried them out on kids in Philadelphia to make sure that they had qualities that would work with the types of kids we were going to be interviewing. And so I put this up here to kind of get you tantalized to go to the website if you're interested in, well, what did you use to look at impulsivity? How'd you think about community context? What'd you do with families? All right? I mean, you can go and look, and we'd be more than happy to talk with you about that. But we see it as a resource. We spent public money to come up with stuff, and if it would systematize some of the data collection in this field, that would be a great thing in and of itself, I think. But I want to mention this other thing down here in the corner, life changes. We did what we called, and I'll show you right now, is a life event calendar for romantic relationships, living situations. This is a living situation, one, and these are 3 cases that have been doctored slightly so they're not identifiable, but this is actually what they had in them. And the way it works is when you interview an adolescent, we would say, okay, let's see, we're here in April. The last time we saw you was November. Okay, this month 2 here is Christmas. You know, and you said your mother's boyfriend moved in, and right after Christmas, so this is January, and we do a couple major life events, and then we say, okay, here you are now, you're in the detention center. How long have you been here? Oh, you've been here 2 months, so you were here this month, that month. Where were you before that? You were at your brother's house. Okay, so we're at your brother's house, and then we fill in each month backwards. We do that for employment history, we do it for living situation, we do it for romantic relationships. After a lot of work, you can string those out for 7 years, okay? And you can get by month variables with amount of time spent in the community or amount of time spent in institutions. You can see from this, you could calculate number of moves, you could calculate number of institutional stays, amount of time spent at home, amount of time spent in somebody else's home, depending on how you want to think about it. And this is just for living situations, but there's a great amount you could do with life event calendar stuff, okay? So where are we so far? We've managed to complete about 90% of the interviews. Our average completion rate is 90% at each of the follow-up interviews over 7 years. That gives us about 21,000 interviews completed in the data set. When you take the release interviews and the collaterals and everything else, it comes to about that. And we've released it. We're posting the data now on ICPSR at the University of Michigan, so people can get access to it. We've done 2 waves of it. The life event calendars will come out in June or July, and that should be the last wave of stuff that we'll put up. But right now, there's all the time interview data out there, and we're really encouraging people to use it. What we're doing now is kind of getting out and advertising the findings, advertising the data sets, trying to get people interested in their utility for them. And we've done about, 65 to 70 academic papers and reports and that sort of thing. We're putting a book together right now on this. But I'm trying to make a pitch because I see a lot of young research faces here. I'm trying to make a pitch to think about this as a potential resource. Okay? Okay, huh? Or a couple old ones. This is just a listing of some topics we've been working on, and I'll be glad to talk with you about any of these sorts of things as we go on. I'm going to spend most of the time today talking about service provision and institutional care, because I think when we talk about development, I'm going to eventually, the punchline is I'm going to eventually get to the point where these kids spend a lot of time in and out of institutions more than anything else. And so we're going to talk about positive development. I don't think you can talk about positive development in these kids without talking about reentry and reunification with families and what that institutional care pattern looks like for them. So that's sort of where I'm headed on this whole idea here, okay? So the adolescents, who are they? About 16 years old on average, 86% male sample. On average, they've got 2 prior court appearances, but almost a third of them had no prior petitions to court. Remember, we're going in and we're picking felony level charges. Some of those kids are in court and adjudicated for the first time for a felony level charge, okay? That doesn't mean they might not be known to the police, it doesn't mean they might not be known to the system and have been diverted earlier, but this is the first time they've actually been petitioned to court, okay? We got an interesting and useful racial ethnicity mix. Some of this has to do with where the study was done. We got one of the reasons we were interested in Phoenix is we got a relatively homogeneous Mexican-American sample in Phoenix that we would not, as a Latino group, we would not have like in Miami or other places. And so it makes for some work that George Knight and his colleagues at Arizona have been doing on enculturation and acculturation in this group, which is, gives us some interesting findings. We have more white kids than you might expect, given that we're at the deeper end of the system. That's again, Phoenix, largely Phoenix phenomenon. They equal opportunity incarcerators and prosecutors in Phoenix. Okay, they got a lot of white kids in Phoenix. But anyway, these are the charges the adolescent came into the study on. Remember, we're looking for felony charges. Slightly different ecology of crime in the different places, okay? A lot more armed robbery in Philadelphia, a lot more assaults in Phoenix. And I could never figure this out until you spend any time in Phoenix and you realize, where are you gonna go? You know, if you steal something from someone, I mean, if you hold somebody up in Phoenix, you gotta run like a quarter mile to get to an air-conditioned building or something, you know? And in Philadelphia, you can grab something, you're gonna be gone in like 7 seconds, you know? It's just, it just sort of struck me as a bizarre thing. And it also reflects the filtering process of the courts. What it does indicate is that about 47% of these kids are there on felony level charges for aggravated assault or armed robbery. Okay, so that's the charges against, serious charges against person make up about half of the sample. Okay. So the first thing about what happens to these adolescents, where do they go, what goes on, is just to look at the rearrests. What do they actually get rearrested less? If you look at just the sample, and you take just the sample 1,354, what proportion of them got arrested each year? Okay, so year one, about 30, somewhere under 30% of them have a rearrest in year one, and then it goes to 31 and then down. It drops off over 7 years. Less of them are getting arrested. If you just take the group and follow them, right? This obviously doesn't tell you a heck of a lot, right? Because if they get arrested in year one and they're locked up for the next 5 years, it's not a surprise they don't get arrested in year 4 or 5, right? So this is either very effective incapacitation or it's actually the sample dropping off for a proportion of them who are still offending. Now, if you remember those life event calendars, we do have information about how much time they spent in the institution or at home. So we can go back and we can calculate a mean rate of arrests given the street time that you were in each year. So you just take the number of arrests for each individual, you divide it by their amount of time they spend in the community. And what you find there is that mean rate also drops off over those 7 years, okay? So there's less of the sample getting arrested. Given the time they're in the community, their likelihood of getting arrested is dropping off over that time, okay? And then you say, well, what did they get arrested for? And we take an 8-point seriousness scale that's developed by Gottfredson. It's used pretty extensively in the literature. Higher numbers mean more serious crimes. So you just take 8 groups. And along the bottom now we have 84 months. Okay, this is still 7 years, it's just in months. And within each month we take the arrests that were produced in that month. Who got arrested in that month? And we look at the median. The median, if you remember, is just 50% of the cases are above that point of seriousness, 50% of the cases are below that point of seriousness. So what you see is, in the beginning, the arrests are more serious, and they do drop off over time down to a point above this. 2 is a misdemeanor, and 3 is basically a drug possession charge severity. Okay, so we've got less of the sample getting arrested. We got them less likely to be arrested when they're on the street, and when they're getting arrested, during those less likely arrests, they're getting arrested for less serious offenses, okay? So rearrest shows a fairly consistent drop-off pattern. The other thing you can do is just ask kids what they did, okay? Because arrests are not the same as what they say they did. We know kids don't get arrested for everything. It's a different lens to look at offending. And if you look at self-report offending, the way we did that is we took 22 items that are at the more serious end of the standard self-report offending scales, and we asked adolescents, in the last 6 months or so, did you do this? Then we asked a lot of other questions if they said yes, were you with somebody and everything else. But let's just say, did you do this? And they say yes. and we verified that they were talking about the same sort of thing. And then we just count up what we call a variety score, all right? It's just simply how many of the 22 did you do? And there's a good bit of literature that this tracks pretty well seriousness and frequency of offending. And when you look at the variety score, it just tells you of those 22 how many you endorsed, right? Now, if you look at the drop-off, it shows the same thing the rearrests do. If you look at the self-report offending, and that is the variety scores drop off over time, all right? So if you just graph them, you'd see that same sort of downward slope in average variety score over time. What we do know, though, is not every kid is going to go lockstep in that drop-off. They're not all just going to say, yeah, you know, year 2, I'm only going to do 4 things this year, okay? So, you know, not everybody's going to go. So what we're trying to do, we took the sample and we looked at, we did what are called trajectory analysis. I don't know if people have done these, but they basically allow you to describe identifiable groups of individuals who follow the same patterns over all time. Let's say we got a group of kids who stay high the whole time, literally and figuratively, and then some who just drop off. They start at a high level of offending and then go down to a low level of offending. It's, as a descriptive method, it's very useful to try to see, are there distinguishable groups in here who follow different patterns? When you do that with the offending over 7 years, you find a large group who are relatively criminally active. So it's about 10% of the sample, all right? Now this is, again, remember, I got 22 things I say to you. You shot at somebody? Oh yeah, I did that. Did you steal any hijack or carjack a car? Oh yeah, I did that. Did you beat anybody up? They had to go to the hospital? Oh yeah, I did that. Did you sell drugs? Oh yeah, I did that. Did you, you know, if you answer 5 of these, you're a pretty busy kind of guy or woman. And so 10% of the sample are about that. Then you've got a twice that size sample who start at the same point. We start at that point of about 5 or 6 and go down very low to about a 1, a level of 1 over the 7 years, right? You got another group out here who are low rising, which has been seen in other longitudinal research, which we didn't see. We didn't see this group when we ran these analyses after 3 years. We ran them after 7 years. We identified a group. And this is a group who are about at age 18 and I think don't have much of opportunity anywhere and tend to be dealing a lot more, you know, dealing drugs and hanging out in places where you end up doing a lot more stuff. Then the 2 groups that are interested are the greater proportion of the sample that report very low levels of offending over that time period, okay? So this didn't, I always emphasize this didn't have to come out this way, okay? I mean, it could have come out 1 group, it could have come out 2 groups, all right? The idea that we've got this group of kids, we went in and deliberately picked serious felony offending kids, and when we do, we only see about 10% of them stay at that high level of offending. That doesn't mean they're not offending, believe me, but in terms of distinguishing characteristics of these kids, there's variability in these patterns they follow over time, okay? What's interesting is that the group membership is not related to the crime they came in on, all right? So along the bottom, let's take all the kids who came in on a violent crime. Remember those kids, the aggravated assaults, the armed robbery kids. And we look at what's the distribution of their group membership of just the violent crime kids. Then you take all the property crime kids, the weapons charge kids, the drug charge kids, and the distribution's about the same. What path they're on bears no relationship to the charge they came in on, even though oftentimes presenting charges related to length of time in a facility or what happens to your disposition, but it's not related to their continued self-reported offending, okay? A set of risk markers that we look at, like family history, antisocial history, such as is related, all right? And it's related in a predictable way. Those kids who offend more are much higher risk. This is just making the point that this kind of law as a blunt instrument for sorting these kids doesn't tell you much about how the movie turns out, you know? And yet risk markers, if we were to think about sort of individualized risks and needs of kids, are related to those later patterns of offending, okay? All right, so where are we at so far? Desisting in offending does occur. We did find it, which we were actually very thankful for. If we didn't, we didn't know what we're gonna do. There's considerable variability within the group and over time, and the presenting offense is a poor predictor of where these kids end up over the 7 years, okay? Now, this was because Patrick said, so what else happens to these kids? All right? This is a less well-analyzed piece of the presentation, all right? One of the things we did find is we had a 3.3% mortality rate in these kids over 7 years, which is about 5 times what you would expect in adolescence in this age group, over this time period. Most of those kids were as a result of homicide or an assault, this lines up with data from Linda Teplin in Chicago. The kids she's followed over the juvenile justice system have an almost identical mortality rate. We looked at some of the distal predictors. African Americans and kids with substance use disorders were significantly more likely to be in this group that died over the 7 years. And because we had the life event calendars, we went to the last interviews we had prior to their death, okay, to try to see, well, what were they doing and what were they involved in at the time. Not surprisingly, carrying a gun, gang involvement, alcohol and drug use, elevated alcohol and drug use, either the consequences of it or dependency symptoms, okay? Substance use, drugs, and carrying guns is not safe. This is not exactly a major breakthrough here, right? Okay. But we're bothered, obviously, by the rate. We then looked at adult role status, how many kids moved into different things. If you just go from when they came into the study to when they left at about age 23 or 24 when we stopped following them. And we looked at employment, education, parenthood, residence, and romantic relationships as potential areas where their lives could change dramatically in that time period. This just shows the status changes over the 7 years. The red shows like what the distribution was like at 6 months, what percentage of the sample were either employed, part-time or full-time, or had a permanent relationship, or you can read along the bottom what they were. What's kind of striking is some things don't change very much for these kids over that time period, and other things do. Parenthood, for instance, is one of them. And you got a question, Pat?
Sure. So how old are they at 7? They're averaging about 23 then?
Yeah.
24? Okay.
So in the left bar, they're 16, and the right bar, they're about 23. Okay? All right. What we're interested in is the prevalence of legal and illegal work by year. As we look at each of the follow-up periods, we just divided the sample into kids who had just legal jobs. Legal work, we consider legal work not, if I'm working for my brother-in-law off the books, we call that legal work, if I'm doing contracting work, okay? Illegal work, we call illegal work, is if I'm holding up my brother-in-law's employees at gunpoint to get their money, that's called illegal work, okay? So we have the distinction between those two. And we were just sort of struck at the number of kids, the relatively flat, constant, about half of the sample who had legal work in any given follow-up period. And not as many of them that were doing just illegal work only. And an interesting phenomenon we're looking at is this crossover between legal and illegal work. And this is the thing we really have to look at, because just anecdotally, I know the number of kids we interviewed, a kid in Philly who was pretty good as a marijuana dealer, decided to get out of marijuana dealing because his girlfriend had a baby and he now had a baby, and so he got a job and he was doing legal work, and then he realized he was only getting X amount in every month, and he needs more than that. He had a figure in his head that he needs for him and his girlfriend and the baby, so he started dealing marijuana again, but not as much as he was before, because he doesn't really want to run the risk. And this was not an uncommon story, of kind of going into work, out of work in that way. Okay. What was kind of interesting was the reported average annual earnings from illegal and legal work by year. And the kids started to earn more, but what was interesting is the amount they were making from illegal work was about 2 to 3 times higher than they were making from legal work. So you were going to make more money doing illegal work, but what was striking, pairing that with the earlier one, it's really a relatively small proportion of the kids were really trying to capitalize on this big differential in terms of income. And it obviously has to do with risk perception. This is educational attainment by age, percent at each age reporting a high school diploma or GED. And again, you can see this is a group that was well below the expected graduation rate in Philadelphia or in Phoenix at the time, okay? So they weren't getting a lot of educational completion. They were, however, likely to become parents during that time period. And you can see by age 20, we've got about 40% of the males and over 50% of the females with taking care of a child. And this is either a biological or other child, okay? The complexities of biological children, and are you taking care of that kid? This is like, did you have responsibilities as a parent? these are overwhelmingly biological children, but there's a number of kids in here who people are taking care of, but they're you know, her former boyfriend is, I'm now with her and I'm taking care of the kid, all right? So by the end, you then look at age 23 or so, you've got about 70% of the females in a parenthood role at this point, okay? What we wanted to look at then was, well, across all these measures, this gives you kind of a scattered look. Are there any patterns in these outcomes at the end that you can say, you know, the kids all hang together in certain ways? You do a latent class analysis. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's basically you take all these variables and you say, are there identifiable groups that are like all high on these and low on those, or high on these two and low on this one, or middle on this, on all of them? So you're really trying to sort cases according to their patterns across multiple outcomes. When we did that, we came out with 4 basic groups. We named them this outside of much better, kind of a stalled out group of kids. It's over a quarter of the kids. They're out of high school, but there's little else positive going on, really. That was the only thing, and they're regularly locked up. They spend a lot of time in and out of institutions. Had another that were anchored by a child, meaning they had a stable romantic partner and some work. They were more likely to be working. Had an independent but transient. There was a group of kids who were working in the community with a partner and a child. And then there was a stable with what we said limited responsibilities. These kids tended to be, I think like 70-some% of them were working, but they were either living by themselves or in someone else's house. They were just kind of adrift, all right? And I'm not exactly sure what to make of these other than as a kind of a descriptor about how the world kind of broke down for them. What was interesting was that these groups were not highly distinguishable along having a high school diploma or a GED or being a parent. That wasn't kind of what made the distinctions among the groups. That seemed to be kind of distributed across all the groups about equally. Being a parent obviously is either a stabilizing and motivating force, or it can be another draining and stressor force. High school diploma and GED doesn't seem to have much relationship here at all, and there's been a number of other analyses about the fact that GEDs really don't buy kids very much in this situation. It certainly didn't in this sample. Okay? So where are we at? Mortality is appreciably higher, low levels of successful transitions. There really wasn't a great positive outcome story here. You know, I can't turn around and say, geez, everybody's life got rosy at the end. It didn't. These kids were well below what might have been achieved at that point in their lives. The involvement in legal jobs alone was higher than expected, frankly. And we didn't think there'd be that much employment. What we have seen in the employment patterns in these kids is getting a job isn't the problem. Keeping a job is the problem. The amount of time they hold a job is very short. And that time expands as they get older. The more we follow them, we see them hold jobs longer. But the thing is, it's at any given time, we have like 70, 80% of these kids report having a job. You know, they get a job. They got it for a month. You know, but they don't keep it very long. And high school graduation and parenthood are strongly linked to indicators of stability. Okay. Another thing I wanted to mention is a preliminary analysis here, and I'm going to run through these relatively quickly for 2 reasons. One is we just did these, and we're not exactly sure, and if you ask me a probing question, I probably won't have an answer. So I'll keep moving. This has been done by Carol Schubert and myself and Lindsay Pitzer, who's our data analyst in Pittsburgh. And what we were interested in here is what we call negligible system involvement kids, all right? So of these kids who come in, they're all here on a felony charge. We look for those kids over 7 years who never came back to an institution, weren't arrested, or if they were arrested, it was 1 arrest for a misdemeanor, okay? So we're saying, weren't there some kids who just disappeared from the system? Well, negligible system involvement, what happened to them? We found 142 of these kids who met this criteria, okay? And 120 of them had both, the great majority of them had no stays in an adult or a juvenile facility and no rearrests over this 7-year period, okay, to their early adulthood. And what we found is, you know, they tended to 40% female. You can read the ethnicity breakdown, and they were from both sites. They were different in that there tended to be more females and fewer African Americans in this group, okay? What we decided to do was get a matched sample, somebody who looked like these kids at this position, because the stuff we know at this position doesn't predict terribly well life outcomes for these kids. So what we did is we went in and we identified cases that looked like these, we're calling them NSI cases at the baseline. We used propensity score matching stuff. We took 133 variables and decided, could we find, the idea is that you take those variables and you model being in one group or the other. And you say, does somebody look like an NSI kid? Because we know some kids who came back at disposition on these 133 variables look like those kids. Well, but their lives turned out differently. So we do that, and if you do this stuff, you can decide how closely they want to be, and we kept them fairly close. And we had 8 cases that couldn't be matched. 134 of those cases were matched with 76 unique cases. So we did replacements, so some of those kids served as matches for more than one. But let's just take the 76 who look like them, okay? So we got 134 and 76. And they were very close. If you do any of this work in propensity score matching, between 0 and 1, you get a score. These matches were within 0.005 of each other, okay? So if they differed, they didn't differ by maybe more than 1 or 2 variables on that list of 133 or 134 variables. And we used in the non-weighted samples, I said the 76 versus the rest of them. They look the same on criminal history at baseline, which is interesting, okay? Again, you look back, they don't have a whole lot more arrests, they don't have a whole lot of reported antisocial behavior, they don't report a whole lot more self-report offending. So at the time you see them at disposition, they don't look real different in this antisocial history stuff. And the type of study charge has the same distribution for both groups, okay, the match group and the NSI kids. Then you say, obviously, well, how they differ over time, what happened over that 7-year period to the groups that both look the same? And the match groups were different on arrest. Obviously, we took the one group because they didn't have arrests. The other group weren't low on arrests, however. They had almost 3 arrests. 83% of them had a stay in a juvenile or an adult facility, which is the average for the whole rest of the sample. And they spent about 16% of their time in institutional care over that 7-year period. Okay, so they look the same. Their histories turned out differently. Then we said, okay, let's just see all the domains that might explain some of this, the changes that have occurred to them over time. And we go with behaviors, experiences, more interventions, social control indicators like routine activities and social capital, transition into adult roles, and then we did attitudes and cognitions and psychosocial development. We used growth curves to try to see did the growth curves in the groups differ, did the slopes differ of change over time. Were proportions different over time? We did a number of different types of analyses. Let me get you to the bottom. There's no difference in a whole lot of stuff, okay? There was no difference over time in exposure to violence, the slope for social control variables, equally likely to get, as I mentioned, the GED and the high school degree, likely to live on their own, likely to be a parent, and whether they were living with an antisocial partner. We have a measure of sort of, is your partner at the time encouraging you to do antisocial things? No big differences in those, all right? And the NSI group did have some more stability in living arrangements, but it's pretty marginal effect. What showed up and was interesting was the attitudes and cognitions and psychosocial development, which we actually didn't think were going to be strong predictors. And by that we mean the attitudes and cognitions. We have a moral disengagement scale developed by Bandura and some measures of procedural justice which grow out of legitimacy of the law concerns and how you think the system treats you. And for maturity of judgment, we use the measures that are used by Kaufman and Steinberg and others in ways of looking at how a kid has consideration for others and changes in impulsivity and so on. Some of the things we found: moral disengagement. Okay, these were the only variables that really came out significant. Moral disengagement. The NSI kids really became much less morally disengaged. They were much more positive about it. And this is a thing like other people deserve to be treated like worms. If somebody comes at you, you're justified in getting back at them, sort of thing. And the NSI kids changed their attitudes. Their slope was different over time. Legitimacy of the law. Their slope was different over time. Okay, they saw the law as much more legitimate from the beginning time to the end of the time. There were differences in self-reliance. Okay, how much they were responsible for what's going on in their lives. Their sense of responsibility and control over their lives changed. And these, yeah.
These are fitted lines, or this is actual data?
These are fitted lines.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. is the predicted probabilities on the Y, right? Okay. And just to give you a feel of sort of the magnitude or what the picture looks like. Also, the money made per day, this was my only slide I tried to do Virginia colors on, of blue and orange, you know, it didn't work out too well. The gap between the income from legal work and illegal work, you can see the NSI group is the top legal, how much they're making on legal work, and the bottom is how much they're making on illegal work. The gap between those two is higher in them than it is in the other group, okay, the match group, all right? So where we're at with this now, we're exploring this, no one domain really explains the differences. The only stuff we saw tended to be these intrapsychic changes. And this has been documented, of course, change in thinking and changes in cognitive behavioral therapy interventions that have effects and these sorts of things. This lines up with a lot of that literature. And it could be, you could argue that some of this growth is maturity, you know, and how can we push kids to think of themselves in a more mature fashion. What we have to explore, obviously, is these role-based changes and the cognitive changes could very easily be synergistic. You know, as certain things happen, we've got to start looking at how one promotes the other. But these are the preliminary findings from what we've been looking at in terms of change over time and social development in these kids. Okay? I want to take about 10 or 15 minutes to do institutional placement. We're going to run till 12:30 or something. Then do questions?
Yes.
You have no idea, Pat.
12:30.
Yes, sounds good. Okay, thanks. Okay. I had mentioned earlier about institutional placement. I just want to give you an overview of this, and I think the summary statement's pretty accurate, that the justice system relies heavily on institutions, and there's a lot of variability in what happens to kids in these institutional placements. This is a graph of one of the adolescents in the study. And here on the left, this is the time, whether they were in the community, in a treatment facility, in a juvenile setting, or an adult facility. And along the bottom are the 84 months of the follow-up period, okay? So this is an adolescent who was in a treatment facility for the first 8 months, came back to the community from month 8 to about month 19, right? Goes for a month into a juvenile setting, comes out, goes into adult, and then, you know, tends to visit the adult facility a lot as they age, okay? This is another adolescent who comes in at age 15, right? In a juvenile setting, out, in, out, okay? And this is just gives you a picture of what the life changes are like in their lives over that time period. Now, you could say, well, that's very dramatic, that's very nice if you show us lines. But when you look at kind of over the thing, 50% of these kids have a juvenile stay, and on average, they have 2 to 3 of them. So that graph there of the kid with 2 to 3 juvenile stays isn't unlikely. I mean, these kids, once they're in the system like this, the average is 2 to 3 juvenile stays. 75% of the sample have an adult institutional stay, and on average, this sample has 5 adult institutional stays, all right? They spend 37% of their 7-year follow-up period in institutional placement. Over a third of the time of that 7 years. 42% of their time before age 18 is spent in an institution, and 30% of the adult time after age 18 is spent in placement. And there's no significant site differences in the number of days in placement. They're 2 very different systems. Arizona has a state-based juvenile system and a different adult system. And we put kids in institutions in different ways, but they come out exactly the same amount of time out of the community in both sites, okay? All right, so some perspective on this, the time spent at school, if you were to take an average adolescent going to college for 4 years and take out the summer vacations, that comes to 42% of this follow-up period, okay? So the same amount of time a nice kid going to college spends on campus is the same amount of time these kids spend of their juvenile, their time in a facility, all right? High levels of time spent in institutional environments, and this is despite what I showed you earlier about the overall drops in self-report offending, the overall drops in arrests, okay? They're still spending a large amount of this period in institutional care, and so there's considerable reliance. This leads to the idea that re-entry is a recurring and constant issue with these kids. We see it as, oh, you lock the kid up once, you have 1 re-entry period. No, no, no. You lock the kid up, he comes back, he goes away, he comes back, he goes away. You know, this is a constant in these kids' lives. All right. So the first thing you might ask is, well, does placement matter? If you send a kid to a facility are they going to have higher rates of rearrest and self-report offending when they get out? If you do the first naive comparison, you just take the first placement. Let's take just the first time these kids are locked up. About 50% of these kids go to an institution as a result of the presenting charge that brings them into the study, all right? So let's just look at the kids who got placed, and let's look at the 2 years after they get out of that placement, because we get these life event counters again, right? We know when they got out. So let's look at their rearrest during that time period, and let's look at the kids who went on probation. The naive comparison is the rate of rearrest of the kids who went to placement is higher than the rate of rearrest in the kids who went on probation, okay? This tells you virtually nothing, right? It tells you, you could say institutions are terrible, they make kids worse, or you could say the judges have great judgment and they sent the right kids to the placement, right? Because those kids were gonna reoffend anyway. All right. Remember our little friend propensity score matching? Now we're gonna go back and we're gonna do propensity score matching again for placement, because it's tough to do a randomized experiment sending kids away for 6 months, all right? For some reason, people just won't go for that. And so the best you can do with a naturalistic data set is to try to make them alike on background characteristics. So we do propensity score matching, modeling the placement effect, the kids what the kids who go to placement look like. Then we take the propensity score of the placed kids and we rummage through the probation kids and find another one who like has a propensity score of 0.4. This kid who went to placement has a 0.4, this one has a 0.4, and this is based on I think 60 variables, 58 to 60 variables. And we take them out and we say they're now a match group. So then we take the placed kids and we match them to kids who look like them in the probation group, right? Then, if you see the rate of rearrest among them, you can say it might or might not be more related to the placement in the institution. What you find when you do that with the match groups, the placement group still has the same rate of rearrest. It's the same group, right? But now we have a different probation group who look like them, and now there's no statistically significant difference to them at all. The institutional placement doesn't seem to make them worse, doesn't seem to make them better. It just really doesn't matter in terms of rate of rearrest. Yeah?
Is the placement, does that include kids who are serving their time in adult facilities?
No, these are all juvenile placements. This is just juvenile placements. We haven't done this with adult facility placements. Again, this is the initial placement, and we took out the transfer kids. We took out the kids who went up to the adult system, okay? And which is important because in Arizona, for instance, 29% of our sample got transferred to the adult system. Okay, 5% got transferred in Pennsylvania. Okay, we had 193 kids go to the adult system in Arizona. Okay.
Would you say what the age is for transfer? What's the minimum age for transfer in both books?
The minimal age, I'm not sure. In Pennsylvania, it varies by the offense. So you can be transferred for first degree murder at 15 and above. As for something else, I can't remember at 16. It's a little complicated. Yeah. But they do. Each state has minimal ages for transfer. They're not like, 3 or something, right? Which not yet. Okay. So then, if we look at this institutional placement and we try to test that effect, the other thing is, well, if adolescents stay in placement longer, is it going to affect rearrest? All right. And you can see the argument again. If they stay longer, they'll just get worse by being in the facility. If they stay longer, they'll get the services they need and they'll do better. Right. So what we do here is we do we break the institutional stay up into, you can think of it like doses, 0 to 3 months, 3 to 6 months, 6 to 9 months, 9 to 12, and so on. Well, if you think of that, then what you want to do is you want to again get this propensity score matching idea, but instead of matching 2 groups, now we're going to match on 65 of 66 variables across that dosage level. So the kids who get 3 to 6 months have the same background characteristics as the kids who get 9 to 12 months. Or who get more than 12 months, okay? So now we got these maps across level of dosage, meaning time spent in the institution, and then you want to see if there's a response curve. The same types of people, if they got more institutional care, did the rearrest rate go up because they got worse? Did it go down because they got some services and did better? This is what you get at each of those dosage levels, all right? What's interesting is this is a flat line. Statistically a flat line out there. Increased stays doesn't reduce rate of rearrest in these kids, all right? You get that elevated short-term stay that's been documented at 2.55. This has been documented with boot camps, short-term institutional stays. We don't trust that figure very much because we've got a small number of observations out there, and we're not crazy about it. And we're also with the longer stays, we're a little concerned. But the middle, we're pretty confident in. And that thing from like 3 months to a year, we don't get an increase in rate of rearrest, all right? Okay, so that's, it doesn't have much payoff in terms of that. The policy message here is, we have, on any given day in the United States, we have 80,000 adolescents in juvenile, court-ordered juvenile placements, all right? Those range in cost, but a fair estimate is about $180 a day, okay? You take 80,000 times 180, you get about $14.5 million a day we spend on having kids in institutional care through juvenile justice. Cut it 10%, all right? Cut these stays 10%. Now, it never translates that way. We all know you don't get it and take the, somebody cashes a check for $1.4 million and gives it to community services. That isn't how the world works. But we got some resources tied up here. If you could save me $1.4 million a day by cutting the institutional stays 10%, you might only retrieve, I don't know, 500,000 of it? 400,000? I don't know. That wouldn't be bad. I think there's some money to be shifted in this area. Okay. Institutional placement and psychosocial development. I mentioned this because another argument could be that kids who go into institutional care get set back as a result of their maturity. Okay, they actually do worse from going to institutional care, and that's related to their offending. So the first step is the relationship between going to an institution affect their psychosocial development? And this is work that was done by colleagues, Dimitrova and Larry Steinberg. And they took the cases and just looked at the percentage of time that a kid was locked up during a particular follow-up period. And they just divided them into, kids who weren't locked up at all, some who were locked up for a little bit of time, some who spent a lot of time, greater than 75% of the time in a facility. Then they looked at their psychosocial development scores in successive periods, right? And what you see is there's a short-term effect of dampening psychosocial maturity in the period after they were locked up. So this is like from age 17 to 18, just illustrating that kids who were locked up in 100% of time prior to that age had lower psychosocial maturity in the year following their release, all right? So there's some dampening effect. If, however, you look at the development of these kids over the entire follow-up period, these aren't different at all. Kids catch up, and they basically still follow the same trajectory over time in their psychosocial development, although there is a short dampening effect from an institutional stay. And this is a finding, actually, we put this out and people said, well, you're really going to say that? And we're going to say, yeah, I mean, this is what the data say. It doesn't appear to have a strong long-term effect on kids' psychosocial development. And remember at the beginning, we talked about the importance of thinking about developmental factors in kids. In this arena anyway, there may be other things that affects a lot. In this arena, it doesn't look like institutional care, although it's pervasive in the system, doesn't seem to have a big long-term effect on psychosocial development. Okay, so that's one thing. The last thing I just want to touch on, and then I'd like to comments and questions, has to do with institutional environments. If we're going to have kids in institutional environments, how much does the quality or aspect of the environment matter in terms of how the kid does when they return to the community? And for this, remember I talked about release interviews, those interviews we did 30 days before an adolescent got out of a facility or 30 days after. These data are coming out of there. There's about 1,158 interviews, one per adolescent. So we don't have multiple interviews from the same adolescent, all right? And it's about their recent particular institutional experience. And we characterize the facilities on 8 different dimensions of the way the place operates. Somebody could come up with 8 different dimensions. These were the ones we saw in the literature. Safety, organization, harshness, meaning like strip searches, reading your mail, that sort of thing. How caring the staff were, caring adults. The flip of that was, do they come to work drunk? Do they use racial slurs with kids? So we get a lot of different reports. We have 20 scores, 20 component scores of sections of an interview that go into the development of these 8 dimensions, okay? And what we're interested in is whether reports on these dimensions of the facilities have a relationship to how the kids adjust when they leave those facilities in terms of their system involvement, which means either get reinstitutionalized or get rearrested 1 year after their stay, or what their self-report offending level is, how much self-reported antisocial activity they report, okay? We control for risk of the kids of future offending using a whole set of those risk factors I showed earlier about antisocial history, family quality, substance use history, and so on. So we take those and we control for age, gender, race, and things like that. And type of facility, actually, eventually. I'll show you that. So this is the basic ideas. Do these dimensions matter as they're reported? You find different dimensions matter for different outcomes. Services and reentry planning dimension is the one that is significant for whether the kid gets rearrested or has reinstitutionalization within the next year. This is stuff like, do you know where you're going when you leave? Did you meet anyone from the facility or service you might be using in the community? Is anyone here a primary counselor for you in planning your departure from here? Does the organization have an emphasis on thinking about your life past institutional stay, okay? This is stuff that institutions do oftentimes, yeah.
In services, did you look at education services for the kids?
We don't have extensive education services, no. No, that's a weakness.
So it's more like mental health services or things like that?
Mental health vocational services, substance use services, yeah. Family involvement, things like that, yeah. Okay, so then, interesting then, the harshness and the level of antisocial peers and the high institutional order is related to self-reported offending. Now this kind of ties in with Sherman's and others' views of kids being almost justified or irritated or bothered by interventions and feeling, okay, I can get away or could get away or it's okay to do other stuff later. And so it's almost like you depending on which dimension you're looking at, you're going to see a different adolescent reaction from the institutional environment. These hold across different facility types. When we look at more secure facilities, we look at contracted residential facilities, the patterns are exactly the same. The facility type does not moderate the relationship between these perceptions and adjustment 1 year later in the community, okay? So then you say, well, what about a place that's just generally more positive? Let's not worry about the dimensions, whether you're talking harshness or planning or whatever else you're doing. What about just a more positive place? So let's take the component scores, all those component scores, and every time a kid's rating is above the median, we'll give them a 1, and every time it's below the median, we'll give them a 0. And we just add up how positive across all these things was the judgment about that institution. So if a place was seen as the best place in the world, it'll get a 20, because it'll always get rated above the median. If it's seen as the worst place in the world, it's going to get a 0, because the kid will always rate it as bad on all of these 20 components. You then look at system involvement, and this again, these are predicted probabilities based on the covariance in the equation already for risk. And you find a reduction. So you really want to take the endpoints because you never trust the endpoints; they're all kind of flaky. But even if you take the last 3 endpoints, you get a reduction of about 35 to 49% in the probability of system involvement a year later, depending on the perceived atmosphere of the institution of the kids, the perceived atmosphere of the institution, okay? Which is really a fairly strong effect. I wish we had a lot of other interventions that could produce this reduction in system involvement 1 year after a particular time point in the kid's life, all right? So the bottom line here is a couple of things. One is institutions, the environment really matters. If we're gonna have kids in institutions, we probably should think about what those environments are like. And the other thing is kids' reports of what the place is like seem to be predictive of how they're going to do. And if you want to set up a quality assurance system, if you interviewed every kid as they left, and you kept a database on how safe they thought it was, how ordered they thought it was, how you could then look, are we more ordered than we were 6 months ago, or are we less ordered than we were? And you would have a running quality assurance system to look at institutional environments and what effects they might have. Okay. A couple things to remember about the study. This is a sample of serious adolescent offenders. These findings don't hold across the whole system. So some findings about mental health relationships and offending that don't hold about kids who are diverted at the front end. These are kids more at the back end of the system. The outcome measures relies a lot on self-reports. There's some concern about validity of self-reports. We have a fair amount of confidence in them. The developmental patterns we see seem to hold up on arrest patterns and self-report offending patterns. When we break like those trajectories out by site, they look the same at both sites. So you know, I put a fair amount of stock in the self-reports. And the study was conducted in only 2 cities, again. So we wanted to do it in 2 cities because if we did it in 1, everybody would say, well, that's Philadelphia, or that's somewhere that isn't us. So we could do it in 2, but to really convince people, you probably have to do it in 50, and it's not going to happen. So it is only 2 cities, but nonetheless, a whole lot of things across these sites. Where we're having problems now is defining positive adjustment, figuring out exactly what that means, and so we appreciate any feedback in that regard. And accounting for these different patterns of institutional stays. You know, those things I showed you where they're in and out and in and out and in and out. Getting those into some analyzable form of some parameter that represents either waiting time, total time, time before, time out, you know, is a rather complicated thing we're working on these days. And also characterize the intensity of interventions. We just looked at length of stay and in that one finding, you know, about rate of rearrest. Well, a lot happens to kids during that time. Did they get more services? Did they get less services? When you present these findings to institutional administrators, they say, yeah, but the kids that stay in my facility all get a lot better services. The reason they're there longer for a reason. They're there to get something. And when we have them longer, we do better work with them. So that's a challenge. How are we going to get at that intensity of intervention and what actually happens in a kid's life during that time? Okay, I'll leave this up here. If you have handouts, I'm not sure, but these are email address. Every time I give this talk, I tell Carol I put her name up here, and she says she's tired of getting calls. Would I please take her name off? But I put it up every time. Feel free to call Carol. And I also, again, want to make another pitch. This is the website. And if you want to find out about the data, you want to find out about the study, we list our publications in there. If there are particular things that interest you, just highlight them, copy them into an email and send them to us, and we'll send you the PDFs. We have them all sitting there so we can get you any articles or any reports you're interested in. It'll also give you a good look at the measures, how they were developed and how they perform. And this is very complementary to if you want to try to use the data at the ICPSR data site. Our information here is more detailed than what you will find in ICPSR about the data. So I would recommend you to look at the site. And you may stumble across some things here that really interest you that we'd encourage you to pursue. And in any way we can help you do that, we're more than happy and willing to do that. I should also mention, just as an aside, we're doing a summer workshop at University of Michigan at ICPSR this July, introducing a 2-day introduction to the data and use of the data. So if people are interested in that. Okay? That's where we are. Thank you very much. Professor Morley.
And if I got this right, the negligible system involvement in the future was approximately 12% of the sample?
Yeah, somewhere there.
Meaning that 88% of the sample either was back in an institution or had a felony arrest or had multiple misdemeanor arrests. Is that right?
No, not necessarily had a felony arrest, might have had multiple misdemeanor arrests. It's more likely to have had multiple misdemeanor arrests than a felony arrest, but you're correct. 82% of those of this sample does go back into an institution within a short time period. Yeah, within that time period. Yeah. No, these are kids. That's why I keep saying this whole institutional, you moving in and out of institutions is really kind of, when you look at the data, that's where you land in a lot of ways. It's a reality for these kids. So, yeah, it's not a rosy outcome. Yeah.
Did you give consideration to the children or to your subjects, whether they came from home or whether they came from having been in the system, meaning Department of Social Services, congregate care, aging out of group homes?
Yeah. Well, most of them, because they were younger, they were average age of 16 and they had committed the crime before 18, we'd have fewer who were actually aging out of care, you know, at 18, like the kids that age out at that point from foster care placement. Many of these kids did have foster care involvement. However, not as many as you think, and I can't remember what the percentage is, but we did code for foster care placements and those sorts of things.
Right.
I think once you get to the end of the juvenile justice system that we were sampling, we don't have as many foster care dual placement kids as you think.
Right.
You know, it's less. I can't remember the exact number, but it was relatively low. Who were dual placement kids.
Yeah.
A lot of them had prior histories possibly with a child protective services or something. And I think that was somewhere around, and that's hard to get. We got all sorts of problems crossing records there in both sites. Our estimates from Philly were about 40 to 50% of them had prior child welfare exposure. Yeah.
Okay.
That makes sense. Not a lot of dual jurisdiction kids at the time. Not many. Yeah.
So did I understand correctly that when you did the propensity score matching, you didn't see differences in rearrest rates for youth who had just probation versus being in a placement?
Correct.
facility? So what do you think are some of the potential implications of that, or how confident are you in those findings?
I'm reasonably confident in the findings. Obviously, the question is it's a limited outcome variable, that it's rate of rearrest. We actually we tested it for reported antisocial behavior to get the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm confident the findings okay. I'm not sure what all the implications are because I'm not exactly sure what happened to all those probation kids who were out there. And there's some differentiation, there's some variability in the placement kids that we know might have happened. So I think all it basically says is that if you have two similarly situated and historical kids, sending to placement isn't going to destroy them, but also sending them to placement and spending a lot of money isn't probably going to get you much in terms of rate of rearrest either. So if you're doing this for public safety purposes, what you're going to get really is an incapacitation effect. While the kid's locked up, they won't be doing crime. But if that's where the debate is, fine, that's where the debate is. Then let's talk about that as a debate, rather than, we locked them up to do the good and we're going to reduce the rate of rearrest by doing it. I don't think, we're not getting anything from it. We would be as safe if that same kid went to the community. At least that's what we say. But it's obviously more complicated than that, So I don't think it's really answered the policy question, but it's the first step there. Yeah.
Is there any likelihood that the expectation of a longer sentence, as opposed to, saying maybe we should open out sooner because nothing good is happening, but if they think they're going to be incarcerated or in a program for 6 months, is that having any deterrent effect?
Well, we also, one section I haven't talked about here, but we did do perceptions of deterrence. In other words, risk of being caught, risk of, it was mainly risk of being caught by different types of offenses, and the value of the cost of punishment, what it would mean. And we do find a deterrent effect from arrest. So you get about a 10% reduction in reported antisocial behavior after an arrest. So kids do respond, but it's not consistent across the whole thing. The kids in the mid-range of perceptions are the ones where you get a big payoff from arrest. So the real good kids who get arrested, the kids who think they're never going to get caught, you can arrest them, you don't get any effect. The kids who think, oh my God, if I do anything, I'll get arrested. If they get arrested, it still doesn't do much to them either. It's the kids from like a 30 to 70% range of risk perception where that effect lies from arrest. So there's some deterrence, but when we've looked at certainty of arrest and severity of arrest, we see the same thing that's in the adult literature, that certainty carries most of the weight. The risk perception of likelihood of getting arrested has a heavier weight in producing any deterrent effect in these kids and in adults than does the amount of punishment. Whether it's 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, the length of the punishment is not as much. The certainty that you will get caught and you will be punished or held accountable or something will happen to you. That is what's carrying the weight out there in the deterrence. And we see the same patterns in these kids as is seen in the adult deterrence literature. It's mostly certainty. So, yeah.
So following these adolescents over 7 years is a big job. What percent of the initial sample were you actually able to follow?
I'm sorry, what?
What percent of the initial sample were you able to follow over 7 years?
Of the 1,354 we enrolled, we have average of 90% of them at each interview, which means we have about, like if there's 14 possible interviews, I can't remember how many interviews there are, it's like, 6 months or something. About 80-some% of them have complete data sets, and then it's 78 or something. I can't remember the exact number. It's reasonably high that if you get most of them, overwhelmingly might be missing 2 or 3 interviews as a result. Because we didn't kick them out when we missed them. So if we found kids that we hadn't seen for 2 years. We found them in Iowa somewhere, you know.
Do you see a lot of people just dropping out?
No,
No? Okay.
no. It's a pretty complete data set. And that's just attributable to the ingenuity of the interviewers. And they're very dedicated and very ingenious group. Yeah.
So, going back, thinking about the latent cost analysis and the sort of cognitive findings, so have you flipped that to look, because it seems to be the next question, so what predicts, right, those cognitive differences?
Right.
And so I'm wondering if you've done any looking at any of the variables that you didn't originally include in the LCA, to see, sort of, are there, what might predict those kinds of changes in cognitive behavior that then could lead to that? So I'm thinking about maybe the contextual variables, relationships with others.
I agree. I think that's where you got to go. I mean, I think that's the next thing is to unravel those patterns of, let's say you're employed for 3 months. Does that change your perceptions of what you think of the legitimacy of the system? What, you know, so we can see the overall effect of the relationships of the attitude change, what we don't have. And there's a whole lot of qualitative literature about sense of agency and that having an effect and being, you know, bouncing off of structural or contextual changes in the kid's life. And I think that's where this stuff has to go. Because this, again, this isn't a straight persistence issue. For a lot of these kids, it's an intermittency thing. And so you really have to figure out, well, what gets you stopping for a while, starting again, stopping for a while, starting again? What are those external pushes that change the attitudes?
Yeah, and it seems to me that beyond, so I think you can look at, so if you're employed for 3 months, but my guess is that it actually matters less whether or not you're employed and what your experience was in that employment, right? So if you were employed for 3 months and got fired and your boss disrespected you and did that, that's likely to lead to not the kind of cognitive change we're talking about versus you had a boss who really took you under your wing.
And those are the data that we would have in the life event calendars.
Yeah.
And that's why we think that's a rich data set, because that's month by month. Employment, income, reason for termination, that sort of stuff is all laid out there. So you can, it allows for sort of an intra-individual analysis of these sorts of things. And I think that'd be very rich analysis. We've not done that.
And the other quick just thought I had thinking about when you said that the kids' ratings of institutional characteristics was a good predictor. I just want to note that's similar to the social support literature. It's kids' perceptions of social support that tends to be the better, that tends to predict outcomes over and above actual sort of observed instances of support.
Right.
So that goes along with other.
That's great. That's great. Thanks.
Yeah, I was talking to some people yesterday who are very involved in research in this state in juvenile justice. So what they were talking to me about, what they wanted was an evaluation of several treatment programs within the institutions.
Mm-hmm.
From your data, is that a worthwhile endeavor, or is it just really being in the institution? I mean, should they, do you have any data here that says these kind of programs in 2 of my Phoenix places look like they did more, or is it just, you know, you played with the word of intensity there at one point. And how do you go about that? What would I tell them?
Well, one of the reasons we don't have good data on that, I think it's a totally relevant question. It's, you know, none of these are uniform effects. We're looking at massive, you know, overall effects that are not, you know, going to dictate what happens in the world, you know, but they're clues. And there's got to be variability. And as we see variability in the perceived institutional environments, there's got to be variability in the types of programming that kids receive in there. I think it's really worthwhile. We didn't do that because we just couldn't afford to do it. Because in order to do it right, you're going to have to go in and look at the place. The best we could do was interview the kids and ask them their perceptions of what services they got. But to do it right is a pretty resource-intensive undertaking. What I can tell you is, our experience is that you won't get much by reading the program descriptions. We've tried to do that in Philadelphia, we did it in Phoenix, and we literally could not code them because they're all jargon filled. You can't tell what happens in the institution until you get on the unit and you see what's going on. That'd be my take on it. But I think it's great. In fact, I think that's where we've got to go. I mean, I don't know how we can't do that. Because I would maintain, yes, we're gonna reduce institutional environments. I don't think we're gonna get rid of institutions. I mean, we've cut, we were at 130,000 kids on any given day, 5, 6 years ago, so maybe 7 years ago. We're now down to 80,000. We're gonna cut it, and we're gonna cut the number of kids under care. But I don't think we're, you know, I mean, I just think there's a place for
One
kids
last
that can't handle it.
question linked to this. In the Philadelphia Phoenix, you know, your sample,
Mhm.
were like there 20 institutions in Philadelphia that you looked at that these kids came from? Or did they all basically come out of 2 or 3?
Now, we examined, I forget the number of institutions in these analyses as the perceptions, but I think our institutional database is about 240 different institutions we've looked at.
Out of the 2? Okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah, some of them I should mention, we have another, when we developed these dimensions, we looked at whether there was sufficient clustering within the ratings to portray an institution. You know, if you think of it as a level model, the individual variability in the ratings, is there a level 2 effect for institution? And yes, there is. That's one of the ways we developed the measures, is that we thought they were actually indicative of particular institutions. And we did that, I think that analysis we did on 185 institutions or something like that. But some of these had low numbers of individuals observing them, like 2 or 3. So then we restricted the analysis to about, I think where we had 5 or more observations per institutional unit. And we get basically exactly the same effects, even though we have larger ones. This is your former colleague Candace Odgers, and Carol and I have that. That's out there. Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned that that institutions engaging residents on their way out about their perceptions would be really helpful.
Yeah.
The questions that you asked, could that serve as a model for like Virginia's Department of Juvenile
Yeah.
Justice?
Yeah, in fact, we've shared that. We've shared it with a few different states. I don't know if Virginia's been one of them, but we've done it with a couple of states, and they're talking about putting a release interview together for kids to do exactly that.
So that's something that we could contact you.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've looked at the copyright problems of the instruments and everything else. I say this because you're going to end up talking to Carol anyway. So it's just, but Carol has worked on this and is very clear about it. And I know we've released it to a few places.
Yeah. And one other question not related. Is there anyone working with the transfer population that you know of that's kind of looking at outcomes for those kids and just doing
Yeah.
research related to that part of the study?
Yeah, we did it in Arizona. We've done a couple papers on transfer in Arizona, and we can send you those. The basic thing is our findings don't line up totally with the rest of the field. Our basic finding is we do get, the general literature says kids who get transferred do worse, they offend more. Ours is that depends on what they were transferred for, and that the violent offending kids actually do better in rate of rearrest after they're transferred, and the property offending transfer kids do worse, meaning transfer hurts them, but the other one, you actually get a deterrent effect. That's not a popular finding in the literature. No one's picked up on that.
Except most of the kids who are transferred weren't for the violent offenses. According to the Fed data.
It depends on how wide the net is there. That's exactly right. And I can't remember what the breakdown is. I thought it was almost, it's about a third, and a third of other weird offenses. Yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly the case in Virginia. The transfer numbers are not for the most serious and violent offenses.
Yeah, and that's a problem. I mean, our argument with that is, if you're not going to get rid of transfer, okay, transfer has been a part of the juvenile system since it was founded. If you're not going to let the judges make the decision, which makes a reasonable amount of sense to me, that's how it's been, that's how it was for a long time. But if you don't want to do that, then take the data that shows you, if you're going to have a big wide net and you've got a bunch of property kids being transferred, that is counterproductive. You still want to transfer kids for beating people over the heads with pipes and disabling them for the rest of their lives, fine, but just do it to them. Don't get a big wide net and get a whole bunch of kids in there who aren't going to get any better as a result. Yeah.
So that you had a very powerful maturity effect, it looked like, both
Yeah.
in the psychosocial and also in the sort of whether or not education makes a difference and all these other things. So, and then you also sound like there's not a huge amount of difference, either pro or con, for institutional being placed in an institution or not was a huge, so it sounds like in some ways there's this, if you think about some kind of holding issues while maturity occurs, you know, that's ultimately what might be going on here, rather than rehabilitation or incapacitation or all these other sort of criminological criminology.
That could well be. I mean, if that argument, if the data had come out differently and we had seen institutions with strong effects reducing psychosocial development, you could make sort of that iatrogenic institutional argument. If you're looking at the link between psychosocial development and offending, I think you're exactly right. It's kind of a holding, maybe some suppression, but generally a holding pattern for kids because we don't know what to do with them.
That's right. I was thinking about getting back to, taking us back to promoting some increase in the moral disengagement piece and then also the investment, because I don't know if you looked at this, but when I was looking at your employment, it looked to me like the illegal employment went down almost 35–40%, and the legal employment went up, I think, almost 100%.
Yeah.
Really, so there were those are relatively big changes. I assume some of it had to do with age. And
Yes.
But just to sort of, this is where you take it back to things people have been talking about for years, is something about kids' investment in legitimate work and bonding to legitimate kinds of institutions. And so, for example, part of the reason you don't hit the guy over the head, right?
Yeah.
That they got to is because you don't want to lose your job, you don't want to have to get arrested, you don't want that kind of thing. So then maybe there's something in there that could be leverage points for focus for starting to be able to move the percentage of kids desisting to a higher number.
And we did, some of the work, some of the group here has looked at effects of employment, and they do vary by age, so that a lot of work hours at a younger age is detrimental, you know, and as you get older, it has a differential effect, much closer to what you're saying, a social investment effect. It depends on the age of the kid at the time, and we've mapped this also by age. You know, you take these data and flip them to do it like an accelerated cohort design, where you got, you know, the kids' observations from 15 to 19, or, you know, 17 to 22 or something. Yeah.
Did I understand correctly that whether they get a GED or finish school doesn't help?
Not finishing, it doesn't have much of an impact, doesn't hang together with the other events in their lives, and doesn't seem to do much. And there's an emerging body of research now that's looked at kind of the effects of GEDs, and doesn't find much in terms of increased earnings or increased stability of employment or other outcomes like that. Even though a lot of places do try to get kids GEDs, it doesn't seem to have much of an impact. And we didn't see it in these data. Yeah.
So I wonder about, I know in all of these analyses you're controlling for time that they're incarcerated or out in the community.
Yeah.
Is there a large enough group of kids who actually have long-term incarceration to just look at them and see if there are some of these sort of normative developmental changes in things like moral responsibility and some of the other psychosocial variables?
Yes.
So the kids who've actually been in sustained institutional stays over time? Or is that
Yeah,
pretty
we
small?
have some. But they're not, it's not a big sample. I think we've got about 45 kids or something who really were, maybe it's 30-some who were in either, usually a Department of Corrections facility the entire 7 years. Okay? More likely it's out in. And some of those spells of being in are extremely long. Some might be 3 or 4 years long. But for a pure institutional experience over this period, it's a very small group. But we do have some who have, 85%, 90% of their time spent in the facility.
Yeah, just thinking about Patrick's comments and wondering about what sort of, would you see anyway, regardless of where they were in terms of.
That's right. Would you see the growth
right.
independent, and would the slope and the growth patterns of those variables be fairly independent of the institutional experience? I think it's a great way to think about it. We haven't done any of that. Yeah.
And I guess even just to build on Patrick's and Jenna's comments, thinking about how this merges with the PYD literature and wondering if maybe these would be youth who we would be identifying as maybe particularly likely to benefit from some of those PYD interventions, if we're thinking about them as having the potential to maybe speed up some of that psychosocial maturation. So if we're thinking about this as like you know, as opposed to just a holding pattern for them until they mature on
Correct.
their own, if we could target them in a way that would help maybe speed up that process as opposed to, you know, keeping them incarcerated for the, you know, extent of their adolescence.
Yeah, no, I think that's, you can only go uphill at this point. It seems to me, in terms of positive development with these kids, they don't get a lot of it. I didn't go into service use here, but I mean, one of the figures that struck me that we followed is kids with diagnosable substance use disorders constitute about 40 to 45% of this sample. If you go in and just do a diagnostic interview with them, you'll find a diagnosable substance use disorder. If you take that sample of kids and you look over the 7 years of their treatment, 30% of that diagnosable group ever gets a community-based substance use service. Okay, this is not a positive development mode, but in general, the level of service provision to this group is extremely low. These are not the kids that most positive youth development programs want, very frankly. So, you know, I think it's an extreme challenge, but as I say, you might just get a kick from regression to the mean on this group if you were to get in there and think in terms of positive youth development. I think that's exactly right. And you wouldn't be a lot of competitors for their time, frankly. You know, yeah.
One last little question. You said that, at least I think you said, these kids came out and were able to get legitimate jobs.
Yes.
My impression has been because they have to put down they have felony problem, that they can't get these jobs, and that a large number of kids spend a great deal of time trying to get a job. But your suggestion was, no, that's not.
Well, I think there's two things. One is I don't know there's a lot of data about that perception that coming out really deters your employment.
Right.
And I'm counting, remember, I'm also counting working for your brother-in-law doing landscaping as a job, okay? So your brother-in-law is not gonna do a check on you. So moving into a career, I think there's a much more of a
or moving to somebody out there hire you.
Yeah.
Safe way to hire you.
Yeah, yeah. And so if you, I mean, a lot of these kids working is informal work arrangements for a time period. So there may be, and I'd argue there probably is, a negative effect from having a record. Although I have looked at that literature a little bit, and I don't think there's a whole lot of data out there, but it's logical. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
I just don't know where the data are if they're out there. Yeah.
Something I had in my head is, this is a fact,
right,
and it may not be.
Right.
Well, also for this category of kids, aren't they mostly juvenile felony adjudications? So they wouldn't necessarily have to check the box. At least as an attorney, I wouldn't advise my client to check the box.
That's right.
If it was a juvenile adjudication.
Yes, yes. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.